Hey everybody, it's Twice as Lively with Kent Heckenlively. This is episode 7, asking the question, is an artist a creator or merely a channel of something else? Okay, so before we get into that question, today is the day of the California primary. And so as you can see right here, I've got my I voted sticker. Maybe I should place that a little more clearly. So you can see, yes, I did my job as a California voter and I went and voted. Yes, I voted for Steve Hilton, not Chad Bianco. And I also pretty much voted a Republican slate. So we'll see what happens in California. For those of you who don't know it, California has something called a jungle primary. So what that means is you do not run as a Democrat. You simply run, and then the top two vote getters, which are normally Democrats in the state, that's who goes to the general election. So we've also got some really strange laws in California. For example, if you go to buy alcohol, you will usually have a have to present ID. Okay. In fact, in putting this video together, I actually had to do age verification. So for me to come to you over this medium requires that I have to prove I am who I am and that I am of a certain age. But here's what happens in California. So you go in to the precinct, to the voting office. I give them my name, and then they ask my address. And that's it. If I provide them my address, then they will let me sign my ballot. It doesn't seem like it's that difficult of a thing to remember an address. If you are looking to, rig the system with a bunch of phony voters, asking them to remember a couple addresses doesn't seem like such a big thing. And maybe I'm a little bit of a troll, but every time I go to vote in California, I actually pull out my driver's license as I'm telling them my name and I put it forward in front of them. Now, it's just kind of funny, and maybe I'm a bit of a troll for doing this, but when I put it forward, the election official has this kind of reaction, almost like a vampire being confronted with a crucifix. They do something like this. Ah, no, I don't need to see that. No. That's voting in California. I can't go to an R-rated movie. I can't get a drink. I can't take a flight across the country without showing my ID. But voting, no ID in California. It's just kind of crazy. Okay. So, as I have told you before, I am a graduate of the Scott Adams School of Advanced Persuasion, and he always started his show with a little bit of coffee and a simultaneous sip. So I'm going to say, here we go with our simultaneous sip. We're just going to have some coffee and a good conversation. All right. Last episode, I was talking about how you deal with the threat of constant worry, because that seems to be something that is endemic in our society, which is we always have that new thing to worry about. Is it the war in Iran? Is it election integrity? Is it a UFO and alien invasion? Our modern world seems to excel at panicking us. So, what we have to do is consciously figure out ways to lower our stress and not live in that state of panic. So, one of the things I like to do, I like to go to the movies. I like to go to the movies because it gets me out of the craziness of the news. And as a writer, as an artist, I like to see good works of art. And I actually have two movies which I consider to be, for their own reasons, works of art. The first is the type of movie that I grew up seeing a lot when I was a kid, but now I don't go to very much. And that is the scary movie. But my son had told me I should really see Obsession and that it was a very well done movie. And I got to say, he was completely right. It's a simple story, supposedly made for about $750,000 by a guy named Curry Parker, who did a bunch of sketch comedy on YouTube. And I think comedy is probably a good training ground for horror because you are trying to provoke a reaction in people. And maybe the best horror does have elements of comedy. And Obsession really did. Obsession plays like an extended Twilight Zone episode where one bad decision leads you down this very perilous path. Now, the one bad decision that the main character Ben made is that there was this girl that he'd been in love with since they were in, elementary school together. And he gets this thing called the wishing willow and he breaks it, and when you break it, you make a wish, and supposedly it comes true really quickly, and his wish is that she would fall in love with him and she would love him more than she loved any other person in the world. You know it's going to go wrong. And it does. It goes delightfully wrong. And it escalates in ways that are so interesting and yet so disturbing. And I hate to say it, but with about 10-15 minutes left in the movie, I walked out because I was too scared. I actually had to call my son and go, okay, tell me how it ended. So it's a great film. I understand why it's doing just gangbusters. Curry Parker has a wonderful future ahead of him as a filmmaker. I hope he's not getting too famous, too young, and 10 years from now, he's got an overdose. So we wish the best for Curry Parker. But one thing I do have to note about the film in watching it, and maybe this is the difference between my generation, which grew up in the 70s and 80s, so I would have been approximately the age of the main character sometime in the 1980s, and today's world. And I was struck by something that I think is a significant difference. So, in my day, especially in a film like this, if there's a long suffering male character and the female expresses receptivity to the advances of the male, everything would happen very quickly. The main character in Obsession seems like he's been brutalized by society, especially for his desire for romance and sex. All I can say is she had to really throw herself at him. And I found that a little bit disturbing. It just didn't seem like today's males have the sort of maleness that I remember. Um, so take that, take that where you will. The other thing I have to say is the actress who played the love interest. Oh my God, she is fantastic. There's something that happens in the film, which is she goes from being totally in love with the main character to having some sort of psycho split where her actual will is trying to reassert itself. And it's fascinating to watch. She does an amazing job with it. And it just makes the film terrifying. So if you want a good scary movie, they don't come much better than Obsession. Okay. So maybe I'm too old to enjoy most horror movies now, and that's okay. I will subject myself to them and take as much as I can, and then probably call somebody who sat through the whole thing to explain it to me. Okay, the next film that I want to recommend, if you need a break from things and realize that there's always things to stress about in life, is the wonderful movie Pressure, starring Brendan Fraser as General Dwight D. Eisenhower in the days leading up to the D-Day invasion. Now, I had known generally that D-Day was supposed to have started on June 5th, 1944, but it was delayed a day for the weather, and it actually happened on June 6th, 1944. But I never really thought much about it. But so much went into that decision that I had no idea about. Now, I had some reservations about Brendan Fraser, who I love, playing Dwight D. Eisenhower. He does a fantastic job at it. And the story of the battle between the meteorologists was just wonderful. It was a complete film, took me through the entire ride, and I left understanding something I had not understood about the D-Day invasion and the very real likelihood that if they'd gotten it wrong, Hitler probably could have held on in Europe. So you got 350,000 men to throw into Europe and you lose them. Well, that affects the course of the war. So if you like scary movies as a way to distract yourself, because there is something wonderful about vicariously escaping death, or you want something a little bit more sedate, those are two wonderful choices for you. So get out to the movies and support them. All right. I wanted to get to the main issue I wanted to handle today, which is creativity. Because I've been hearing a number of things in the news that I'm not quite sure how I respond to them. So, for example, Tucker Carlson is talking a lot about good and evil these days. And I'm not saying I go along 100% with what he's saying, especially when he starts saying that anything that is UFO or alien connected is likely demonic. But his bigger point is that whether people realize it or not, they are always expressing some religious or spiritual belief, and that we need to pay close attention to what those people are saying and why they're saying it. What's in their hearts? What's in their souls? And I find myself intrigued by that question, especially because there's been a long time belief that if you are an artist, you are, for lack of a better way of saying it, touched by the gods. You are divinely inspired. You have some sort of muse that you tap into. And it's interesting for me because I am a writer and I'm a pretty prolific writer. And the question I have is, am I creating things or am I simply tapping into it? What athletes often call flow. There's something very much like flow in writing. And I notice it in my writers group when we sit down on a Sunday, hit the timer for an hour and write. Most of the writers seem to be very concerned about what they're creating. What are the words that are coming out on their computer screen? And I'm not that way. I would say I get into a flow state, and that's how I'm able to do it. And to Tucker's point about who are you serving, that's an important question, and it's something that I wrestle with. So a story that I often tell is about why I wear this St. Michael's medallion around my neck. I've been wearing this since December of 2019. Now, in December of 2019, I was getting ready to publish my book, Plague of Corruption. And there was something odd that was going on with me. I had these consistent, constant thoughts that I needed to do something spiritually to declare myself to be of a certain side. Yes, I knew I wanted to declare myself to God, but the form that would take was something I was uncertain about. And so, for lack of a better way of saying it, I just kind of let my mind flow and tried to see what would come up to me. And eventually, I hit upon St. Michael. Being Catholic, St. Michael's a big thing, or is a big figure. But the reason I chose St. Michael is he reflected something I wanted to emulate in my own life. So, if you know your Bible, you know that St. Michael was the leader of God's army in the fight against Satan. So, he was God's strongest warrior. So, yeah, that appeals to me. But there was one other thing which really appealed to me about St. Michael, and that is that in the Middle Ages, there was this tradition which developed about St. Michael that he weighed the souls who wanted to get into heaven. And part of the folklore is that Michael kept putting his scales, his thumb on the scales of justice, and kept letting too many people in, and God kept getting angry at him. So those two things, being a fearless warrior against evil, appealed to me, as well as the idea that you're gentle to other human beings and you give them grace and mercy, perhaps more than they deserve, because each one of us probably doesn't deserve as much mercy as God gives us. And that is all to God's credit. So it was very interesting to me that my book, Plague of Corruption, became such a rallying point against COVID, because I really felt in December of 2019 that something evil was coming into the world. And I wanted to declare which side I was on. So when the country closed down in March of 2020, and then my book published in April of 2020 and became such a flashpoint for those fighting the COVID lockdowns, it didn't seem that much of a surprise to me. It was one of those moments where I felt something moving inside of me, and I don't know what that is, but I want to stay on that side. So in preparing today's broadcast, I actually did a search for artist and the idea of being touched by the gods. And so I want to read a little bit of what came up, just because I thought it was interesting. Because, when you're an artist, the question is, oh, you're so smart. Well, maybe, but maybe I'm also opening myself up to things that need to be done. And that's often how I feel, which is writing doesn't exhaust me. I actually feel more energized after writing 1,000 or 2,000 words than I did before. So here's a little bit of what AI came up with. Artists touched by the gods spans the pantheon of mythic, historical, and contemporary creativity. Whether literally divinely inspired in antiquity or channeling the divine to create masterpieces, the concept weaves through art history. Going back to the Greeks, the Muses, the 9 daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, lived on Mount Olympus and were responsible for the inspiration of all art, music, and poetry. When the Romans got a hold of the Greek pantheon, or apologies to the Greeks, it was the Greeks, not the Romans. Apollo, the Greek god of light, truth, and music, he acted as the patron and leader of the Muses. So Apollo is inspiring human beings to create art, music, and poetry. Now, when we come to the Christian era, this persisted. Now, during the Renaissance, artists viewed themselves as instruments of a higher power, translating the perfection of heaven into earthly art. For example, Michelangelo, often described as a creator touched by the divine, his work on the Sistine Chapel depicts the moment God imparts the spark of creation to humanity, which many interpret to be a metaphor for God passing the artist's touch to humanity. And this also exists in many other traditions. For example, Hinduism. In Hinduism, creators and artists often drew from spiritual forces, invoking figures like Saraswati, the Hindu goddess of creativity, wisdom, and the arts. So, this idea that regardless of your culture, if you sense that spirituality is an important part of your life, you will believe that this artistic impulse comes from someplace outside of yourself. And it made me think of some other works of art. When I was a young man and traveling through Europe, I had my copy of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. I figured, like, okay, one of the longest books ever written. I'm on a long trip through Europe. Let's do Tolstoy. And so, War and Peace is the story about Napoleon invading Russia. And Tolstoy was very much in the same vein of believing not only that artists are inspired by God, but that nations themselves may not have that much power over what happens. So the way that War and Peace unfolds, it's that Napoleon is destined to go into Russia. He is destined to fail in Russia. He is destined to be pushed back by Russia and eventually lose his crown. And Tolstoy has a view of history as embodying these great forces. Now, call it the forces of history, call it the forces of good and evil. But the idea is that we human beings are not necessarily in charge of everything, that we have to be comfortable with the fact that we're not really in control. Maybe we need to be a little more comfortable with the idea that we're not really the creators. The creation is taking place someplace else, and we are assisting in it. Maybe the way a midwife assists in the delivery of a child. So it makes me think about the current situation with our war with Iran. Is this an inevitable clash? Well, if I look back to it, I can remember being a young man in 1979 when the Iranians stormed our embassy and held 55 of our diplomats hostage for 444 days, resulting in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Now, there's a deeper history there. If 1979 to 1980 is just your framework, then you're going to say, oh, those bad Iranians. Well, you got to go a little bit deeper. When I was in college, one of my professors was escaped from Iran. He had fallen afoul of the Iranian authorities in 1953 after the CIA overthrew President Mossadegh, the leader of Iran. The Shah instituted a brutal regime run by the Savak, the secret police, who did a lot of bad things. Now, some will say, not as bad as the Ayatollah. And I'll leave that for other people. But my point is, history goes back longer than you think it does. And so I understood 1980 was probably inevitable given what had happened in 1953. I mean, if somebody came in and overthrew my president, yeah, I'd make sure that things got normalized. With that being said, let's talk about what's happened since 1980. Have the rulers of Iran modified or moderated themselves at all? No, they haven't. They haven't reached out to the world. sought peace, and that has been a problem. And so here we are in 2026. That is 46 years away, 47 years away from the Iranian Revolution. And the Iran that I remember as a young man chanting death to America and death to Israel is pretty much the same Iran as today. So, is it inevitable that after 46 years of chanting death to America, that the Americans might want to take some action? 46 years of sponsoring terrorism. Now, I'm not saying the United States has not done some bad things, but we'll sit down and talk to anybody. And that's something that Trump has demonstrated in spades. There's a problem in North Korea. Hey, let me go talk to Kim Jong-un. Let me, sit across the table from him. Let him hear what he has to say, and I'll say my piece. So the Iranian regime has seemed incapable of doing that. So is this clash inevitable? I would say if I was looking at the world through a Leo Tolstoy frame, I'd say, yeah, this was probably inevitable. Did Trump exercise it at the appropriate time? Well, we know they don't have nuclear weapons, so probably a good time. The other thing that I think is missing from a lot of the conservative commentary, which seems to be very anti-Israel at this point, is that the other Middle Eastern nations seem to be really okay with what we're doing. Now, to my conservative brethren, let me get myself in even more trouble. Yes, I agree with you that AIPAC should register as a foreign lobbying organization. So, yeah, that's probably going to get me put on the list. Okay, point number 2. Yeah, what's going on in Gaza needs a closer look. I'm not telling you what should be done. I'm just saying this seems like a little bit much. But remember, 3,000 people died in 9/11. How many people died in the invasion and occupation of Iraq? Supposedly more than 1 million. How many died in Afghanistan? I don't even know the numbers. So go into it with a sense of humility. I'm not saying the United States is great. I'm not saying Israel is great. I'm not saying anybody in the Middle East is great. I'm saying we're all a bunch of sinners. But let's try to make things better. I am very hopeful that the situation in Iran will resolve itself because I have had the experience of having very close Persian friends. They're wonderful people. It seems like a great culture. And I want everybody to get along. Sorry, that's just my deal. Whether you are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, I don't care. I like to get along with people. That's my flaw. One of the criticisms that makes me laugh about my books, because they're supposed to be so highly political, is I'll have somebody on the liberal side of the spectrum say, Ken, you did a really good job, but you're too nice to these right-wing guys. And on the other hand, I'll have my more conservative friends go, Ken, you did a really great job, but you're too nice to these left-wing guys. Well, if that's the worst thing you say about me, well, I consider that a compliment. I want to be known as somebody who likes people because I genuinely do. We're all going through the same thing: life, death, raising our kids, caring for aged parents. These are the things that should connect us. How do we live our lives? Do we live our lives with one of integrity, with one of service, or are we just looking out for ourselves? So, to my Christian audience, I love you. To my Jewish audience, I love you. To my Muslim audience, I love you. To my Hindu audience, I love you. Anybody else out there, I love you. Okay? Let's just have coffee and conversation and figure out how to make the world a better place. I think that if we let go a little bit and maybe just get into a flow rather than trying to figure out all the structures, we'll probably do a lot better. Because I have this idea that whoever created us probably wants us all to get along. Just like every parent hopes that all their kids get along and genuinely like each other. So, to the people of the world, I genuinely love and like you. And I just hope we all get along and we all get to someplace better. So, have a great day, everybody. Bye.